Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Appalachian, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1952 brought an unusual silence to the hollows of Mercer County, West Virginia. Local residents would later describe it as the kind of quiet that settles over a place when something fundamental shifts beneath the surface. The coal mines that had sustained the region for generations were beginning to show signs of exhaustion, and with them, the hope that had kept families rooted to these ancient hills for decades. It was during this period of economic uncertainty that Cornelius Grimm emerged from what most locals considered a well-deserved retirement. At 73 years old, Grimm had spent the better part of 5 decades working the deep shafts and narrow tunnels that honeycombed the mountainside around his property. His weathered hands bore the permanent stains of coal dust, and his lungs carried the telltale wheeze of a man who had breathed too much of the mountain's dark interior. Yet something in his pale blue eyes suggested an energy that seemed inconsistent with his advanced years. Grimm owned a modest tract of land on Bent Creek Ridge, approximately 8 miles from the nearest town of Bramwell. The property included a farmhouse built in 1897, a collapsing barn, and several acres of dense woodland that climbed steeply toward the summit. What made his land particularly noteworthy to those familiar with the area was the presence of an abandoned mine shaft that Grimm himself had excavated in the 1920s during a brief period when he had attempted to establish an independent mining operation. The shaft had been sealed in 1931 following what official records describe as structural instability concerns. Local mining inspector Harold Vestick noted in his report that the tunnel showed signs of improper support framework and posed potential hazards to anyone who might attempt to explore its depths. The entrance was filled with loose rock and topped with a concrete cap, effectively closing what Grimm had once hoped would be his path to modest prosperity. For more than 20 years, the sealed mine remained untouched. Grimm continued to live on the property, tending a small garden and occasionally taking seasonal work with larger mining companies in the region. Neighbors described him as cordial but solitary, the type of man who acknowledged others with a nod but rarely engaged in extended conversation. His wife Prudence had died in 1949, and their only daughter had moved to Baltimore years earlier, leaving Grimm to navigate his final years alone among the hills that had defined his entire existence. The first indication that something had changed came in late September 1952, when several residents of Bramwell reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles traveling the winding road that led to Grimm's property. The narrow dirt track had rarely seen traffic beyond the occasional delivery truck or Grimm's own aging pickup, yet over the course of several weeks, neighbors observed cars with license plates from neighboring states making their way up the ridge, usually arriving in the early morning hours and departing before sunset. Postmaster Ezekiel Thorne later told investigators that Grimm had begun receiving an unusual volume of mail during this period, including packages that required special handling due to their weight and size. When Thorne inquired about the increased correspondence, Grimm explained that he had placed advertisements in mining trade publications seeking individuals interested in what he termed collaborative excavation projects. The specifics of these projects, according to Thorne's recollection, were never clearly articulated. The advertisements themselves have never been recovered, despite extensive efforts by both local authorities and later researchers to locate copies in the archives of various mining journals from that period. What is known comes primarily from the testimony of individuals who responded to these solicitations, several of whom would eventually become central figures in the events that followed. The first documented volunteer was Jeremiah Caldwell, a 45-year-old former coal miner from Beckley, who had been unemployed since a mine closure the previous spring. Caldwell's wife, Rosalind, later told investigators that her husband had received a handwritten letter from Grimm in early October, detailing an opportunity to participate in what was described as a final excavation of significant personal importance. The letter, according to Rosalind's testimony, emphasized that the work would be both physically demanding and potentially lucrative, though no specific monetary amounts were mentioned. Caldwell departed for Grimm's property on October 15, 1952, telling his wife that he expected to be away for approximately 1 week. He carried with him a canvas duffel bag containing work clothes, basic tools, and enough food for several days. Rosalind noted that her husband seemed unusually optimistic about the opportunity, speaking of it as a chance to contribute to something meaningful during what had been a difficult period of unemployment. The second volunteer was Vincent Maddox, a 38-year-old mining engineer from Charleston who had recently completed a contract with a large coal company and was seeking independent consulting opportunities. Maddox's landlord, Sherman Polk, later reported that Maddox had described the project as involving the exploration of previously sealed mining infrastructure with particular emphasis on documenting structural characteristics that might prove valuable for future development. Maddox arrived at Grimm's property on October 18th, driving a well-maintained sedan that several neighbors noticed parked near the farmhouse over the following days. Like Caldwell, he had indicated that his involvement in the project would be relatively brief, though he had been somewhat less specific about the exact duration of his stay. The third and final volunteer was Augustine Holloway, a 51-year-old geologist from the University of Maryland who specialized in Appalachian mineral formations. Holloway's department chairman, Professor Duncan Blackridge, later stated that Holloway had taken a brief sabbatical to pursue what he described as field research of personal interest. Unlike the others, Holloway appeared to have some academic motivation for his participation, though the specific nature of his research objectives was never clearly documented. Holloway reached the property on October 21st, completing what local residents would later refer to as Grimm's collection of volunteers. For the next several days, the four men were observed working around the sealed mine entrance, apparently engaged in the process of removing the concrete cap and clearing debris from the tunnel opening. The work appeared to progress steadily, with the sound of hammers and other tools audible to neighbors during daylight hours. Martha Covington, whose property bordered Grimm's land to the north, reported that the activity seemed to follow a consistent pattern. Work began each morning shortly after sunrise and continued until mid-afternoon, when the men would retire to the farmhouse. Evenings were marked by the glow of kerosene lamps in the farmhouse windows, and occasionally the sound of voices engaged in what appeared to be earnest discussion. On October 27th, the sounds of excavation ceased abruptly. Covington noted that she had become accustomed to the rhythmic noise of the work and found its sudden absence unsettling. When she investigated by walking to a point where she could observe Grimm's property, she saw that the mine entrance appeared to have been fully reopened, with a clear pathway leading into the mountain's interior. The following morning, Covington observed Grimm walking alone around his property, attending to routine tasks such as feeding his small flock of chickens and checking the well pump. The vehicles belonging to the three volunteers remained parked near the farmhouse, but the men themselves were nowhere to be seen. When Covington called out a greeting across the property line, Grimm waved but did not approach for conversation. This pattern continued for 3 days. Each morning, Grimm emerged from the farmhouse and went about his usual routine, showing no apparent urgency or distress. The volunteer vehicles remained stationary, and no sounds of continued excavation work were heard. By October 31st, Covington's concern had grown sufficiently that she decided to walk to the farmhouse and inquire directly about the welfare of Grimm's guests. Grimm received her at the front door with what she later described as his typical courtesy though she noted that he seemed thinner than she remembered and that his eyes held an intensity that struck her as unusual. When she asked about the whereabouts of the other men, Grimm explained that they had entered the mine tunnel 3 days earlier to conduct detailed surveys and had not yet returned. He expressed confidence that they would emerge when their work was complete, noting that underground surveying often required more time than initially anticipated. Covington's subsequent testimony reveals her growing unease with this explanation. She observed that the mine entrance appeared undisturbed, with no evidence of recent foot traffic or equipment being moved in or out. Additionally, she noted that the volunteers' vehicles showed signs of having remained in place for several days, with morning dew undisturbed on their surfaces and leaves beginning to accumulate around the tires. When she suggested that perhaps someone should enter the tunnel to check on the men's welfare, Grimm became noticeably more reserved. He indicated that the tunnel system was complex and potentially dangerous, requiring specific knowledge of its layout to navigate safely. He assured her that the volunteers were experienced in such matters and had been provided with adequate supplies and safety equipment. Covington departed the property with significant reservations about the situation, but uncertain how to proceed. Local law enforcement in 1952 consisted primarily of a part-time sheriff who covered several counties and generally became involved only when specific crimes were reported. The disappearance of adults who had willingly entered a mining tunnel, while unusual, did not immediately constitute grounds for official intervention. Over the next week, Covington continued to monitor activity on Grimm's property. The routine remained consistent. Grimm emerged each morning, attended to basic farm maintenance, and spent portions of each day sitting on his front porch, apparently reading or engaged in quiet contemplation. The volunteer vehicles remained untouched, and no evidence of activity around the mine entrance was observed. On November 8th, Covington encountered Bramwell postmaster Ezekiel Thorne at the local general store and shared her concerns about the situation at Grimm's property. Thorne revealed that he too had begun to wonder about the unusual circumstances, particularly since he had been expecting to receive outgoing mail from the volunteers who would presumably need to communicate with their families about extended stays. This conversation prompted Thorne to review his postal records for any correspondence from Grimm's address during the period in question. He discovered that no mail had been sent from the property since October 26th, despite the presence of multiple individuals who would logically be expected to maintain contact with their home communities. Thorne's growing suspicions led him to contact Rosalind Caldwell in Beckley, ostensibly to verify her husband's mailing address for a package delivery. During this conversation, he learned that Caldwell had not communicated with his wife since his departure for Grimm's property nearly 3 weeks earlier. Rosalind indicated that while her husband could be forgetful about correspondence, such extended silence was highly unusual and had become a source of significant concern. Similar inquiries to Charleston and Baltimore revealed that Vincent Maddox and Augustine Holloway had likewise failed to maintain contact with their respective communities. Maddox's landlord reported that rent for November had gone unpaid, while Holloway's department chairman noted that the professor had failed to attend scheduled meetings and had not responded to multiple attempts at communication. Armed with this information, Thorne approached Sheriff Clayton Rutherford, whose jurisdiction included Mercer County. Rutherford, a pragmatic man with little appetite for what he considered unnecessary drama, initially showed limited interest in what appeared to be a case of adults choosing to extend their stay at a remote location. However, the accumulation of concerned family members and the unusual circumstances persuaded him to visit Grimm's property for an informal inquiry. Rutherford's visit occurred on November 12th, nearly 2 weeks after the volunteers had last been seen. His subsequent report, archived in the Mercer County Sheriff's Office, provides the most detailed official account of the property's condition at that time. The farmhouse appeared to be in normal order, with the signs of recent habitation, but no evidence of multiple occupants. The volunteer vehicles remained parked near the house, their contents undisturbed and fuel gauges indicating they had not been driven for an extended period. The mine entrance presented what Rutherford described as a puzzling situation. The tunnel was clearly accessible, with the concrete cap removed and debris cleared from the opening. However, there were no obvious signs of recent passage, such as disturbed earth or equipment tracks. More significantly, Rutherford noted that the entrance appeared to have been deliberately obscured with carefully placed rocks and brush, creating the impression that the opening had been naturally concealed. When Rutherford questioned Grimm about this arrangement, the elderly man explained that he had taken steps to secure the entrance to prevent unauthorized access while the volunteers conducted their work inside. He maintained that the three men were engaged in detailed mapping of the tunnel system and had indicated that their survey might require several weeks to complete thoroughly. Rutherford's report notes that Grimm appeared physically and mentally stable, showing no signs of distress or deception that might suggest criminal activity. However, the sheriff also recorded his observation that Grimm seemed unusually committed to discouraging any attempt to enter the tunnel, citing safety concerns and the potential for interfering with the volunteers' work. Despite his reservations, Rutherford concluded that no laws had been broken and no evidence existed to suggest that the missing men had met with foul play. His report recommended continued monitoring of the situation, but stopped short of advocating for immediate intervention. This decision would later be the subject of considerable criticism, particularly from the families of the missing volunteers. However, it reflected the practical limitations of rural law enforcement in 1952 and the general assumption that adult citizens were entitled to make their own decisions about extended absences from their normal routines. As November progressed, the situation at Grimm's property settled into an eerie routine. Grimm continued his daily activities with apparent normalcy, maintaining his garden, caring for his animals, and occasionally receiving deliveries from local merchants. The volunteer vehicles remained in place, gradually accumulating the detritus of abandonment, fallen leaves, bird droppings, and the subtle signs of mechanical deterioration that accompany extended disuse. Local residents developed mixed opinions about the circumstances. Some shared Covington's suspicions that something was seriously wrong, while others accepted Grimm's explanation that the volunteers were simply engaged in extended underground work. The lack of precedent for such a situation left the community uncertain about appropriate responses. The first significant development occurred on November 20th, when a delivery truck driver reported seeing smoke rising from the area of Grimm's mine shaft. The driver, Moses Templeton, had been transporting supplies to a logging operation higher up the ridge and noticed what appeared to be the organized burning of materials near the tunnel entrance. When he mentioned this observation to his dispatcher, word quickly spread through the local community. Several residents, including Martha Covington and her neighbor Floyd Brennan, decided to investigate the report by hiking to a vantage point overlooking Grimm's property. From their position, they confirmed that a controlled fire had indeed been burning near the mine entrance, with smoke rising from what appeared to be a carefully constructed pile of materials. The fire was small and well contained, suggesting deliberate rather than accidental ignition. When the fire had burned down to smoldering remains, Covington and Brennan observed Grimm emerge from the mine tunnel, carrying what appeared to be additional materials to add to the burn pile. His movements seemed purposeful and unhurried, indicating that the burning was part of a planned activity rather than an emergency response. This observation prompted renewed concern about the fate of the three volunteers. If the men were indeed conducting surveys inside the tunnel, the presence of fire near the entrance raised obvious safety questions. Additionally, the deliberate nature of the burning suggested that Grimm was disposing of materials that he preferred not to preserve, leading to speculation about what exactly was being destroyed. Sheriff Rutherford was notified of these observations and returned to Grimm's property on November 21st. His second report describes finding the remains of the burn pile, which contained what appeared to be clothing, paper documents, and other personal effects. When questioned about the fire, Grimm explained that he had been disposing of materials left behind by previous mining operations, cleaning out storage areas to make room for the current survey work. Rutherford requested permission to examine the tunnel entrance and was granted access by Grimm, who accompanied him to the site. The sheriff's description of the tunnel interior notes that it extended approximately 40 feet into the mountainside before branching into multiple smaller passages. The main tunnel was adequately supported with timber framework and showed no obvious signs of structural instability. However, Rutherford also noted several features that struck him as unusual. The tunnel floor appeared to have been recently disturbed, with areas of loose earth that suggested recent excavation activity. Additionally, he observed that the airflow within the tunnel was poor, creating conditions that would make extended work uncomfortable and potentially hazardous. Most significantly, Rutherford found no evidence of the volunteers' presence within the accessible portions of the tunnel. No equipment, supplies, or personal belongings were visible, despite Grimm's claim that the men had been working continuously for nearly a month. When the sheriff questioned this absence of evidence, Grimm indicated that the volunteers had carried their materials deeper into the tunnel system beyond the main passage. Rutherford's report expresses growing skepticism about Grimm's explanations, but notes the continuing absence of clear evidence that crimes had been committed. The sheriff recommended that family members of the missing men be contacted to determine whether formal missing persons reports should be filed, triggering more extensive investigative procedures. This recommendation led to visits from Rosalind Caldwell and other family members, who arrived in Bramwell during the last week of November to demand more aggressive action from local authorities. Their presence created the first significant pressure for a thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding the disappearances. The investigation that followed was hampered by several factors that reflected the limitations of rural law enforcement in the early 1950s. Physical evidence collection was minimal, relying primarily on visual observation and basic documentation. Scientific analysis of materials was not readily available, and investigative techniques that would later become standard practice had not yet been widely adopted by local sheriff's departments. Nevertheless, the combined pressure from family members and growing community concern prompted Sheriff Rutherford to organize a more systematic examination of Grimm's property. This effort, conducted on December 3, 1952, involved several deputies and a representative from the State Mining Inspection Office who was qualified to assess underground safety conditions. The expanded search team began with a thorough examination of the mine tunnel system, using portable lighting equipment and safety protocols appropriate for underground exploration. Mining Inspector Gerald Marsh led this portion of the investigation, documenting the tunnel's condition and searching for evidence of recent human activity. Marsh's subsequent report describes a tunnel that extended much deeper into the mountain than had been previously realized. Beyond the main passage examined by Sheriff Rutherford, the tunnel continued through a series of narrower passages that showed evidence of more recent excavation work. Some of these passages were barely wide enough for a single person to navigate, while others opened into small chambers that appeared to have been deliberately enlarged. In the deepest accessible portion of the tunnel system, approximately 200 feet from the entrance, Marsh's team made the first significant discovery: a cache of personal belongings that clearly belonged to the missing volunteers. The items included identification documents, personal letters, and a notebook containing what appeared to be survey notes and sketches of the tunnel layout. The notebook, which belonged to Augustine Holloway, contained entries dated from October 22nd through October 26th. The early entries describe routine surveying activities and note the unexpected complexity of the tunnel system. However, the final entries reveal growing concern about Grimm's behavior and intentions. Holloway's October 25th entry states, "Grimm has become increasingly agitated about our progress. He insists that we must reach what he calls the final chamber before completing our work. When we express concerns about safety and the time required for proper documentation, he becomes argumentative and suggests that we lack commitment to the project. Caldwell and Maddox share my growing unease about the situation." The final entry, dated October 26th, is brief and troubling. Grimm has sealed the tunnel entrance from the outside. We can hear him moving rocks and debris. When we called out, he responded that we must finish what was started before being allowed to leave. Our lamp fuel is limited, and we have no tools capable of clearing the obstruction. We are effectively trapped. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a potential homicide inquiry. The notebook provided clear evidence that the 3 volunteers had been deliberately imprisoned within the tunnel system, and that Grimm was directly responsible for their confinement. Sheriff Rutherford immediately placed Grimm under arrest and charged him with kidnapping and reckless endangerment. Additional charges were expected pending the location of the 3 men, who were presumed to be deceased given the elapsed time and harsh conditions within the sealed tunnel. Grimm's response to arrest was characterized by investigators as unnaturally calm. He did not deny the charges or attempt to provide alternative explanations for the evidence found in the tunnel. Instead, he repeatedly stated that he had completed the work that needed to be done and that the volunteers had served their intended purpose. When questioned about the specific fate of the 3 men, Grimm indicated that they had been incorporated into the mountain through processes that he described as both necessary and irreversible. His statements were sufficiently coherent to rule out obvious mental illness, but contained references to concepts and objectives that investigators found difficult to comprehend. Dr. Franklin Morse, a psychiatrist from the State Hospital in Huntington, was brought in to evaluate Grimm's mental competency. Morse's assessment, completed in December 1952, concluded that while Grimm showed signs of obsessive thinking patterns and possible paranoid tendencies, he remained legally competent to stand trial and understood the nature of his actions. However, Morse's report also notes several disturbing aspects of Grimm's psychological state. The elderly man appeared to believe that the 3 volunteers had willingly participated in what he termed the completion of an essential task that had been left unfinished for many years. He expressed no remorse for their deaths, but rather seemed to view their sacrifice as both necessary and honorable. Most unsettling was Grimm's insistence that his actions had been guided by what he called instructions from the deep places. He claimed to have received these instructions through dreams and waking visions that had begun shortly after his wife's death in 1949. According to Grimm, these communications had gradually revealed the true purpose of his mind tunnel and the steps required to fulfill that purpose. The trial of Cornelius Grimm began in March 1953 and attracted significant regional attention due to the unusual nature of the crimes and the defendant's bizarre motivations. Prosecutors faced the challenge of proving murder charges without having recovered the victims' bodies, relying instead on circumstantial evidence and Grimm's own statements. The defense strategy focused on Grimm's mental state, arguing that his advanced age and social isolation had led to the development of elaborate delusions that impaired his judgment. Defense attorneys presented testimony from neighbors who described Grimm's gradual withdrawal from normal social interaction following his wife's death, suggesting that grief and loneliness had contributed to his psychological deterioration. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Grimm's actions had been carefully planned and deliberately executed over an extended period. The placement of advertisements, selection of volunteers, and systematic elimination of evidence showed clear premeditation rather than impulsive behavior driven by mental illness. the jury ultimately convicted Grimm of 3 counts of second-degree murder, rejecting the defense argument for reduced charges based on diminished mental capacity. The verdict reflected the panel's conclusion that while Grimm's motivations were clearly abnormal, his actions demonstrated sufficient awareness of their consequences to warrant full criminal responsibility. Grimm was sentenced to life imprisonment and died at the state penitentiary in Moundsville in 1957, approximately 4 years after his conviction. Prison records indicate that he remained largely withdrawn during his incarceration, spending most of his time in solitary activities such as reading and letter writing. He maintained his belief in the righteousness of his actions until his death, never expressing regret for the fate of the 3 volunteers. The bodies of Jeremiah Caldwell, Vincent Maddox, and Augustine Holloway were never recovered, despite extensive searches of the tunnel system and surrounding areas. State mining inspectors sealed the tunnel permanently in 1954, citing safety concerns and the site's association with criminal activity. The concrete barriers installed at that time were designed to prevent any future access to the underground passages. Grimm's property was eventually sold to satisfy legal claims filed by the victims' families, though the remote location and negative associations made it difficult to market. The farmhouse stood empty for several years before being purchased by a timber company that harvested the woodland and allowed the structures to deteriorate. By the 1960s, only the foundation and a few standing walls remained visible. The case received limited attention from outside the immediate region, partly due to the rural setting and partly because the circumstances were so unusual that they defied easy categorization. Local newspapers covered the investigation and trial, but national media showed little interest in what was perceived as an isolated incident involving individuals who had voluntarily placed themselves at risk. However, the case did attract the attention of Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a professor of criminology at West Virginia University, who specialized in the study of unusual violent crimes. Dr. Sinclair's research, conducted between 1958 and 1962, involved extensive interviews with investigators, family members, and community residents who had been involved in the case. Sinclair's analysis, published as a journal article in 1963, noted several aspects of the Grimm case that distinguished it from more typical instances of multiple homicide. The careful selection of victims, the elaborate preparation required for the crimes, and the defendant's apparent belief that his actions served a higher purpose suggested psychological dynamics that were not well understood by existing criminal typologies. Most significantly, Sinclair identified what she termed instrumental ritualization in Grimm's behavior, the use of seemingly meaningful procedures and locations to justify and organize criminal activity. She theorized that Grimm had developed an elaborate internal mythology around his mine tunnel that transformed murder into what he perceived as a necessary and sacred act. This analysis helped explain why Grimm had shown no remorse for his crimes while maintaining detailed awareness of their practical consequences. In his mind, according to Sinclair's interpretation, the deaths of the 3 volunteers were not murders, but rather essential contributions to a larger purpose that superseded individual welfare. Dr. Sinclair's research also uncovered several previously unknown details about Grimm's background that seemed relevant to understanding his motivations. Interviews with elderly community members revealed that Grimm's original mining operation in the 1920s had been marked by unusual incidents and worker complaints about conditions within the tunnel. Former employee Matthias Crenshaw, interviewed in 1959 at the age of 81, recalled that Grimm had insisted on personally supervising all work in the deeper portions of the tunnel and had become increasingly secretive about the purpose of certain excavation activities. Crenshaw also noted that Grimm had spoken frequently about completing the design of the tunnel system, though he had never clearly explained what this meant or why it was important. More disturbing was Crenshaw's account of an incident in 1930 that may have contributed to the tunnel's official closure. According to his recollection, a young miner named Tobias Wynne had disappeared while working alone in one of the deeper passages. Grimm had claimed that Wynne had abandoned his job without notice. But Crenshaw and other workers suspected that something more serious had occurred. The official records from that period made no mention of Wynne's disappearance, suggesting that it had either been covered up or attributed to the high turnover rate common in independent mining operations. However, Crenshaw's testimony raised the possibility that the three 1952 victims were not Grimm's first, but rather the culmination of a pattern of violence that had begun decades earlier. Dr. Sinclair attempted to locate additional records that might corroborate this theory, but found that most documentation from Grimm's original mining operation had been lost or destroyed. The absence of these records was particularly frustrating because they might have provided crucial insights into the development of Grimm's psychological state and the origins of his apparent obsession with the tunnel system. One document that did survive was a geological survey conducted in 1928 by the State Mining Office, which included detailed maps of Grimm's tunnel layout. These maps revealed that the tunnel system was far more extensive than had been generally known, with passages extending deep into the mountain and connecting to natural cave formations that had not been thoroughly explored. The survey also noted several features that the state geologist had found unusual, including chambers that appeared to have been carved according to specific geometric patterns rather than following natural ore deposits or practical mining considerations. These chambers were described as serving no obvious functional purpose and representing a significant investment of labor for no apparent return. This discovery supported Dr. Sinclair's theory that Grimm had been pursuing objectives other than mineral extraction during his original mining operation. The geometric patterns suggested deliberate design work aimed at creating specific spatial relationships within the tunnel system, though the intended purpose remained unclear. In 1962, Dr. Sinclair attempted to gain access to the sealed tunnel for direct examination, but her request was denied by state authorities who cited both safety concerns and respect for the victims' families. The tunnel remained permanently sealed, leaving many questions about its internal features unresolved. However, Sinclair's research did uncover one additional piece of evidence that proved significant to understanding the case. Among Grimm's personal effects, seized during his arrest, investigators had found a leather-bound journal containing detailed sketches and notes related to the tunnel system. This journal had been briefly mentioned in court proceedings, but had not been thoroughly analyzed. With permission from the court, Sinclair examined the journal and found that it contained decades of planning notes, apparently related to the modification and use of the tunnel system. The early entries, dating from the 1920s, focused on practical mining concerns and standard excavation techniques. However, the later entries showed a gradual shift toward more abstract considerations related to what Grimm termed spatial harmonics and resonance patterns. The final entries in the journal, written shortly before the arrival of the three volunteers in 1952, described detailed preparations for what Grimm called the completion sequence. These preparations included specific procedures for guiding individuals into the deeper portions of the tunnel and methods for ensuring that they would remain there permanently. Most unsettling was Grimm's apparent belief that the death of the three volunteers would somehow activate the tunnel system, transforming it from a static structure into something functionally meaningful. He wrote extensively about the need for organic integration between the tunnel and its human occupants, suggesting that he viewed the murders as a form of architectural completion rather than simple violence. Dr. Sinclair's analysis of this material led her to conclude that Grimm had spent decades developing an elaborate fantasy around his tunnel that eventually motivated him to commit multiple murders. The combination of social isolation, unprocessed grief, and obsessive focus on a single project had created conditions for what she termed delusional actualization, the transformation of fantasy into criminal action. Her research was never fully published due to concerns about sensationalizing the case and potentially inspiring similar crimes. However, her work contributed to improved understanding of how social isolation and unchecked mental deterioration could lead to extreme violence in rural settings where community oversight was limited. The case also prompted changes in local law enforcement procedures, including requirements for more thorough investigation of missing persons reports and improved coordination between sheriff's departments and state agencies. These changes were intended to prevent future situations where warning signs might be overlooked due to jurisdictional limitations or resource constraints. In the decades following the trial and Grimm's death, the case faded from public attention but remained a subject of periodic interest among researchers studying unusual violent crimes. The remote location of the events and the destruction of the physical evidence made detailed follow-up investigation difficult, leaving many aspects of the case permanently unresolved. The families of the 3 victims eventually received financial settlements from Grimm's estate and from a state compensation fund established for crime victims. However, the lack of recovered remains meant that formal burial and closure were never possible, leaving emotional wounds that persisted for many years. Rosalind Caldwell, who never remarried after her husband's death, spent considerable time and resources attempting to locate organizations that might be able to recover the remains from the sealed tunnel. These efforts were consistently unsuccessful, partly due to technical challenges and partly because authorities remained reluctant to disturb what had become, in effect, a sealed tomb. The property where Grimm's farmhouse had stood was eventually purchased by the state and incorporated into a larger tract of public land. The area remained undeveloped, with access restricted due to the presence of the sealed mine opening and concerns about unstable underground conditions. Warning signs were posted to alert hikers and hunters about the potential dangers of unauthorized excavation attempts. In 1967, a team of university researchers attempted to conduct ground-penetrating surveys of the area to map the full extent of the tunnel system without actually opening the sealed entrance. These surveys revealed that the underground passages were indeed extensive, covering several acres beneath the mountain's surface, but provided no information about their contents. The surveys did confirm that multiple large chambers existed within the tunnel system, consistent with the geometric patterns noted in the 1928 Geological Survey. However, the purpose and significance of these chambers remained matters of speculation rather than established fact. As the years passed, local knowledge of the case diminished as older residents died or moved away, and younger generations showed little interest in preserving memories of disturbing events. By the 1960s, most residents of the area were aware only of vague stories about something that happened up on Bent Creek Ridge, without specific knowledge of the details. This gradual forgetting was probably beneficial for community healing, but it also meant that important lessons about the warning signs of dangerous isolation and mental deterioration were not effectively transmitted to new residents of the region. The social factors that had enabled Grimm to operate without detection for decades remained largely unchanged, creating potential for similar situations in the future. The sealed mine entrance became gradually less visible as vegetation grew over the concrete barriers and natural weathering obscured the artificial modifications to the landscape. Occasional hikers still discovered the site, but most assumed they had found the remains of typical abandoned mining infrastructure rather than the scene of multiple murders. In recent decades, the case has been occasionally revisited by true crime researchers and writers seeking unusual stories for popular audiences. However, the remote location, limited surviving documentation, and lack of living witnesses have made thorough investigation difficult. Most accounts rely heavily on court records and Dr. Sinclair's research rather than original source material. The fundamental questions raised by the case remain largely unanswered. What psychological processes transformed an apparently ordinary retired miner into a calculating serial killer? How did decades of social isolation and unprocessed trauma contribute to the development of his elaborate violent fantasy? And what specific features of rural mountain culture in the 1950s enabled such extreme behavior to develop without effective intervention? Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the warning signs were present and observable, but were not recognized as indicating serious danger until it was too late for the victims. The gradual nature of Grimm's deterioration, combined with cultural norms that respected privacy and individual autonomy, created conditions where dangerous obsessions could develop unchecked. The case serves as a reminder that isolation and unchecked mental deterioration can lead to extreme consequences in any setting where community oversight is limited. The vast and rugged landscape of Appalachian West Virginia, while beautiful and culturally rich, also provided ideal conditions for someone like Grimm to pursue deadly fantasies without detection. Today, the mountain where Cornelius Grimm sealed 3 innocent men in his tunnel of death continues its ancient rhythm of seasonal change. Trees grow taller over the forgotten graves, while deep beneath the earth, in chambers carved by human hands for purposes we may never fully understand, silence reigns absolute. The volunteers who came seeking honest work found instead a darkness that had waited decades for their arrival. Sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings, local residents claim they can hear sounds from deep within the mountain, not the settling of stone or the movement of underground water, but something that might be voices calling from places where no voices should be. Whether these sounds represent reality or simply the echo of a community's unhealed trauma remains a question that each listener must answer alone. What we know with certainty is that 3 men entered a tunnel in the autumn of 1952 and never emerged. What we suspect is that they became part of something larger than themselves, something that their killer believed was worth their lives. What we fear is that in the deep places of the earth, some forms of completion can never be undone.